This is etching. This is my etching press. It's 40 inches wide by a 70-inch long press bed. I have a piece of clear acrylic on here in order to have a template for where to put the plate and how to organize the paper. The other important aspects are blankets, which are used to push down the damp paper that's been soaked for several hours to pull up the ink from the grooves of the plate. And I should back up and mention that there's intaglio, which is printing from grooves. And it includes etching, dry point, and engraving. Engraving where you're carving the material out to create spaces to hold the ink. Dry point is where you scratch the plate. You're not actually removing any metal, but you're creating gullies and hills that contain the ink. And then etching, where you're chemically removing from the plate. So the press has a solid steel roller above and one below, and then the bed that moves in between. You can have them automated with electric, but manual really tells you a lot because you can feel when you're covering or compressing the plate and you know where you are in the process. It's also especially helpful for monoprint where you might want to have maximum pressure or less pressure and you have a better feel by a manual press. So in order to get to the point where you have a plate to print, you start out with a piece of copper, or actually I should mention you could use other metals. Copper is really good because it etches well, and once you set up your acid for a particular metal, you have to stay with that metal or you set up a battery type situation. So I use copper. This is a plate which was done as a project where different individuals were asked to add their own impression onto the plate. So started out with the copper plate covered with a ground, which is asphaltum, wax, and solvent. And then people drew through that and created images, which is essentially what I am doing. This is a more recent one that was done in Harrisonburg, Virginia, at Arts Council of the Valley. Had several students come in and draw and created this image. The reason why you can see the line so well is because I inked and printed it several times, and there's always a little bit of residue of ink in the plate. So in the process of printing a plate, I would take the plate and draw ink over the surface and then clean it off with tarlatans using a series of, it's cheesecloth with starch in it, mashing in the ink, and then slowly removing the ink from the surface, placing it on the press bed and putting a damp piece of paper over that and running it through the press. And each image, each impression takes one inking and one printing. You can't get multiples from that. So, acid bath. I use ferric chloride, and it's the same material that's used to etch printed circuit boards. It's not a true acid, it's a base that eats metal. And I have a large bin I built for soaking really large pieces of paper, and then I also use smaller trays inside. And I use water from my dehumidifier, since it doesn't have residue that accumulates in water from pipes, which of course doesn't hurt us to drink it, but it can create a scum on the paper. And over here I have blotters. So after I soak the paper, I blot it out using heavyweight absorbent sheets of paper. This is an aquatint box. Aquatint is a strange name for a process, but it's taking powdered rosin, and rosin is actually tree sap, comes from very particular pine trees. And that material looks kind of like amber, and it's pulverized in a mortar and pestle and turns into a white dust. It's the same rosin that's used for violin bows, for baseball players to grip the bat better by putting their gloves into the material, and ballerina toe shoes. So an aquatint box, and you could have it on different levels, but this one I have a fan at the bottom, and I put a teaspoon of rosin on each blade of the fan, and then have a rack up here for the plate, but first I would turn on the fan, puff up the rosin, and give it a couple minutes for any large chunks to fall down first, if there's, you know, difference in weight of the pulverized material. And then place the plate in here for about 10 minutes until you have an even layer of dust or a fresh layer of snow, it kind of looks like. And then you heat that plate so that you're melting those particles just enough so that they remain individual particles. And when you etch that material, or etch the plate, you're etching between those particles, and you're ending up with almost microscopic level of little posts, so you can etch tonal areas, and it's very helpful, makes etchings much more interesting to have line plus tone. An important aspect of preparing the plate for a number of processes and also inking is a hot plate. In this case, what I have here is a hoist, but it's got a steel top, and I have a small hot plate here underneath. And I warm the plate until it's too hot to keep your hand on it. So it's just warming it, it helps the ink flow, and also it's what I use at a much higher temperature to bond the particles of rosin to the plate. Here is a drying rack. It's similar to what's used for screen printing. So people printing t-shirts or posters would put pieces on the drying rack. So I have a piece that I worked on here and printed it, then just put it here to dry. And I was using a process called chine-collé, where I actually printed on a piece of thin paper with the attempt to bond it onto the main paper as it ran through the press. Something went wrong here, and I decided to take it apart, and so that's why you're seeing it in two pieces. That you have a history of everything you've tried, and so you can go back to and say, that was where I went wrong. And that, but this is just a file of a piece that I started actually quite a while ago.
So you'll do a mini study of what you're going to do before you do your large piece. These are like studies?
They are to test out an idea, like a format. But what happens, that sort of the problem is that I try out the idea and I do a piece, and then they say, oh, okay, I'm ready to go on to something else, and I don't really want to repeat it again. I think that's what's going on, but you know, it kind of dawns on you after a while. And I also date these things when I print them, because it gets confusing. But I'll just lay out a couple. There's font on it, but it's the concept of a female savior. It's essentially what the Madonna is, but surrounded by animals being affected by global warming. And then in the center part is supposed to be, and I've changed it a few times, but switching over to renewable energy. So I have some hydro and rivers and wind turbines and solar panels, and I haven't quite worked it out. But this cloak was supposed to be like solar panels, and then the night sky is in there.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.